Hey everyone, happy 2025. Welcome back, and welcome if you're new here. This is Hearth of Haemonia. We talk about belief in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and especially those beliefs that were out of the ordinary or off the beaten path. Esoteric beliefs, anything from mythology, witches, astrology, magic, all sorts of things like that. So today what we're doing is we are talking about the Roman goddess Vesta, goddess of the hearth and by extension the home. For anyone who doesn't know, in the fall of last year, 2024, I ran a seminar where we looked at this goddess in detail and talked about her symbolism, her priestesses, and their role in Roman society. It was amazing. I learned so much. And again, just thank you to everyone who participated. It was so awesome. And the purpose of today's video is really to share some of my main takeaways from that seminar. I've had some time to think things over, go through all of my notes, and pull away. I chose 3 things that I think are really important that I came away from this seminar, having these things on my mind. So without further ado, I'm going to share these things with you, and then we're going to put Vesta to rest for a little while on the channel. I'm sure she will be back, but for now, we're going to move on to other things. So this will be kind of a wrap-up of what we talked about in the fall, and what we've covered elsewhere on the channel. And so, yeah, without further ado, let's talk about Vesta. So my first takeaway from the Vesta class is actually a point about her Greek counterpart, Hestia, also a hearth goddess. These two shared a lot in terms of their symbolism, what they meant to people, how they were worshipped. And in particular, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about Hestia and Hermes and their relationship as it relates to this very important Greek social idea of Xenia. So in order to do that, we have to begin with the Homeric hymn number 29 that is dedicated both to Hestia and to Hermes. And I won't read the whole thing, I'll put it up on screen. This is my translation, so of course commentary and corrections are welcome. But I just want to focus on these couple of lines that say, "Since you are gracious, come to aid with she who is both worthy of reverence and dear. You both dwell in beautiful houses, knowing the friendship of each other's minds." And for any Hellenists listening, the word for mind here is phrein. So for those of you who are not Hellenists, phrein is kind of like a combination of like your heart, where your passions lie, and your mind, where thoughts and knowledge occur. So it's a combination of both of those ideas, and it's usually located in your midriff somewhere. What sticks out to me in these lines is that the poem characterizes the two gods, Hestia and Hermes, as friends, and makes reference to their homes. This immediately brings to mind for me the concept of Xenia, which was a set of social customs that acted almost like a shorthand for two parties to have a peaceful meeting, especially in the home. That's kind of where this took place, which is relevant for Hestia as a goddess of the hearth and home. And it's an almost ritualized dance between guest and host. If you'll bear with me for a minute, the word in Greek, xenos, sometimes it's translated in older translations of Homer, for example, as like guest friend. It has 2 meanings. One, it means a stranger in a very neutral sense. Anyone that you do not know is a xenos. And it can also, by extension, mean someone who lives in a different country, so that's where you get like xenophobia, for example. It's the same word, but it also means a guest in your home. The word itself brings strangers immediately into this role of welcome strangers, guests that come into the home and are welcomed. And that is how Xenia works. When someone comes into your home, the first thing you have to do is provide for them. If they need food, drink, if they need washing up, new clothes, whatever it is, you provide for them as best as you can. And then you start asking questions like, what is your name? Where are you from? It's very much the opposite of how we live today, at least where I live. If someone knocks on your door, the first thing that you do is run away. But in ancient Greece, this is certainly not the case. And by the way, I should point out that this custom is featured most prominently in early stuff like Homeric literature. The custom is kind of a shorthand for people to be able to get along. If you are seeking sanctuary in the house of someone that either you don't know or maybe you don't get along with, that person is religiously obligated to provide for you. And in fact, sanctuary is kind of like an offshoot of Xenia, where the hearth is the center of sanctuary. So if you are appealing to someone, you say, I'm taking refuge here, I'm taking sanctuary, you can't hurt me. You would do so at the family hearth. Xenia is a way to quickly establish bonds, as I've said, and these bonds are lasting. So just an example of how this plays out in Homer, in the Iliad in Book 6, in the middle of a battle scene, these two fighters, Glaucus and Diomedes, meet on the battlefield. They're on opposite sides of the war, and their expectation is that they are going to fight each other to the death. Before they begin fighting, though, they do have a little bit of a conversation, and they discover that their grandfathers had been bonded by Xenia. Diomedes' grandfather, Oeneus, had hosted Glaucus's grandfather at his home and provided Xenia for him, and they exchanged gifts of friendship. This is where the friendship part comes in here, as part of the custom of Xenia, and then they went on their separate ways. Now, because their grandfathers did this so many years ago, that means that Glaucus and Diomedes, in fact, should not fight each other because they are bonded in this generational friendship. And in fact, they don't fight each other. They exchange armor as further gifts of friendship of Xenia, and then they go on their separate ways. So what does this have to do with Hestia and Hermes and their friendship? Well, the reason that I draw the connection here, that for me it is aligning, is because Hestia is a goddess of the home, of the physical space of the home, the hearth fire, the family in a broad sense. And Hermes is a god who comes and goes, who is primarily known for traveling and communication. Although Hermes is a god who technically has a place to live, you usually encounter him when he shows up in literature somewhere else. He is on the move, he is visiting someone, he is traveling somewhere, even traveling between the halls of Olympus down to the underworld and elsewhere on Earth. Hestia, on the other hand, does not move. She stays fixed in her hearth, and she guards the home, and she doesn't go anywhere. The fact that you see these two joining together in friendship, meeting in a place, tells me that Hermes is visiting Hestia at her home, and their friendship is an ideal or a model of Xenia. When you see these two come together, they kind of represent, at least to me they seem to represent, this dynamic between someone who is coming from outside into the home space and then someone who is receiving them in their home and treating them with all due respect and kindness and indeed friendship. So these are all things that are on my mind when it comes to Hestia and Hermes, especially as I spend most of my time at home. I work from home. I'm always interested in how people interact in the home. So anyway, I would be interested to hear what anybody thinks about that. It's kind of a jumble in my mind still, but I think that these ideas are all related somehow, and that Hestia plays a role in Xenia in a way that is, I think, in some ways obvious, especially with like Sanctuary, but in other ways less obvious maybe. Moving on to my second major takeaway from our study of Vesta is the political position of the Vestal priestesses. The Vestals were political in some ways that were obvious. So their temple complex, that is the Temple of Vesta, and the home of the Vestals, called the Atrium of the Vestals, was located in the Roman Forum. So this is the center of Roman public life, political life, economic life, religious life. It is all in the center there in the Roman Forum. So they are in the heart of the action. That's a very obvious way that the Vestals would have been involved in politics just by their mere presence. And they also serve this goddess who is or at least she's characterized as a very patriotic goddess. She represents the health and safety of the Roman state as a whole. Not necessarily its individual citizens, but the idea of Rome, the existence of the state as a whole, is represented by Vesta. And so the Vestals, in their primary religious function, are tending the fire of Vesta, keeping it burning, keeping this eternal flame alive. And thus that is a political act, because what they are doing is keeping alive the Roman state. So these are ways that I think are kind of obvious that the Vestals were highly politically placed. But then there are other ways that are not as obvious, at least to me. The first being Augustus. During the Augustan period, Vesta's cult was placed very prominently. It was given high importance. Not that it wasn't already, but you see in the Aeneid and in Ovid's Fasti, just two examples off the top of my head, where Vesta features prominently, and this point about her protecting the Roman state is emphasized as Augustus is trying to bring everybody together. So a couple things happened during Augustus's reign that affect the way that at least I see the Vestals and their political position. So the first is to say that the Vestals directly reported to the Pontifex Maximus, who is kind of like the Pope. He's the head priest in charge of all of the other religious cults. And the Pontifex Maximus is the only male that is allowed inside the Vestal complex. The Vestals report directly to him. He has oversight over their activities and their general lives, and he can also enter into their home, whereas other men could not. So after the death of Lepidus in 12 BCE, Augustus takes over the role of Pontifex Maximus, which he stays in for the remainder of his life, and then after him, that office just becomes one of the functions of the emperor. As Augustus is setting up his empire, he is saying now that the Vestals directly report not just to the Pontifex Maximus, but the emperor as Pontifex Maximus. And so he becomes their direct supervisor, and so naturally having interactions with Augustus puts the Vestals in a very, very, very prominent political position. Now, they're not telling him what to do, but they are around the center of power, if you will. And by the way, as the only man allowed to enter the Vestal temple complex and the home of the Vestals, he is the only man allowed to take a look at all of the very important and secret documents that are kept in there, including wills. This was the whole scandal with Mark Antony's will. So long before Augustus took over as Pontifex Maximus, so back when he was not allowed inside the complex, he wanted to get a hold of Mark Antony's will to prove that Mark Antony had sort of changed his allegiance to Egypt and Cleopatra and abandoned Rome. And he wanted to show that Antony had made provisions in his will to that end. And so he asked the Vestals if he could have Antony's will to look at and read publicly, and they said that they would not give him the will, but, come and get it, if you will. And he did, going into the temple complex long before he was technically religiously allowed to do so. This is a whole big scandal. But then he takes that power, and so he now can go in and look at the wills of prominent senators if he wants. He can go in and look at any document that is stored in the Vestal complex. He also made another temple to Vestal that was attached to his home on the Palatine Hill. So the Pontifex Maximus traditionally lived in the Roman Forum in a small home that was right next door to the Vestal complex. But Augustus has grander plans for himself, and so when he sets himself up on the Palatine, he makes an additional temple to Vesta in that space so that the Pontifex Maximus can still live next to where the cult of Vesta is happening. Now, we don't have a ton of sources about this shift. It wasn't like he shut down the first temple and then changed everything over to the new temple. It was just an additional temple so that he could make sacrifices to Vesta and so on. But you'd have to imagine that the Vestals would have visited that temple at least and would have had obligations to that temple. They probably would have had to maintain that temple and carry out certain rites at that temple as well, putting them now in the palace of the emperor where they can talk to the women of the house and they can get invited to dinner parties and all sorts of things, which of course happened. The Vestals were usually the daughters of prominent politicians anyway, so they would have been highly politically placed whether they were Vestals or not. But anyway, so all of these things that Augustus does in relation to the Vestals show how the Vestals were in the center of the action. And finally, on the point of the Vestals' political functions, I have a couple of examples of individual Vestals using their prominence, using their influence to make something happen for a member of their family. So we have a legal example and then a kind of political military example. During the legal career of Cicero, he defended a man called Marcus Fonteius, whose sister, Fonteia, happened to be a Vestal. And on the day of the trial, she and other members of Marcus Fonteius' family were present in the court. That's not unusual to have family members appear as an object of pity for the jury. It's like a well-known, like even ancient Greek rhetorical tactic to bring the family of the accused and to beg for them to be spared. So this Vestal Fonteia was present, and Cicero uses her presence to his advantage and closes the speech with a talk about this Vestal in particular, and then the Vestals and Vesta more broadly. So I'm going to read you a passage from the end of his speech in defense of Marcus Fonteius. It's kind of long, but it's well worth it, I think. Cicero says, "If Indutiomarus himself, leader of the Allobroges and all the Gauls, should despise forces so powerfully gathered to aid us, shall he drag and tear my client, even from the embrace of that peerless though unhappy lady his mother, while you raise no finger to stay him? Shall he do so, though upon the other side a Vestal Virgin casts her arms about the brother of her blood, imploring your protection, gentlemen, and that of the Roman people? She has devoted so many years to propitiating the immortal gods on behalf of you and your children, that she may well today propitiate your hearts when she appeals on behalf of herself and her brother. What protection, what comfort is left to the poor lady if he's taken from her? Other women can bear protectors for themselves. They can have at their own homes a companion and a participant in all life's chances. But to this maiden, what can be dear or delightful save her brother? Suffer it not, gentlemen, that the altars of the immortal gods and of Mother Vesta should by the daily lamentations of their virgin be put in mind of your tribunal. Have a care, lest it be said that the undying fire guarded by Fonteia's sleepless toil through the watches of the night has been quenched by the tears of your priestess. To you, a Vestal Virgin extends in supplication the same hands which she has been accustomed to extend to the immortal gods on your behalf. Bethink you of the peril that lies in wait for such pride, if you should be deaf to the appeal of one, the rejection of whose supplication by the gods would dissolve the fabric of our daily lives. So Cicero's argument, in summary, is that this Vestal Virgin only has her brother to comfort her because, as a Vestal Virgin, the name implies she cannot marry, she cannot have children of her own while she is in the service of the goddess, which is a 30-year appointment. And so a conviction of her brother, a guilty conviction of her brother, taking him away from her, putting him in prison, would leave her so upset that she would cry so hard that the eternal flame would be put out, and Vesta would take notice of how upset she was and why she was upset, and come after the tribunal and also the entire Roman state as an extension of that. How convincing this argument was, I don't know. I think it is certainly laying it on a little thick here, but the point stands that this woman's presence in court was significant, and Cicero ends the speech with this. This is his final word in defense of Fonteius, is that not for any of the facts of the case that we've already discussed, but for the fact that his sister is a Vestal, you should acquit him, because she is so important. So Fonteia is not directly acting here. She's just being spoken about. We don't know if she spoke in court. It is unlikely, I think. But nevertheless, her mere presence is enough for Cicero at least to try to sway the jury in favor of her brother. In an earlier example, we have another sibling dynamic duo here, this time Appius Claudius Pulcher and his sister Claudia. So Appius Claudius Pulcher had successfully led the Roman army to victory against the Seleuci. So in the year 143, he asked the Senate for approval to have a triumph, like a military parade with him as the guest of honor, we'll say. And the Senate said no, but Claudius Pulcher was not taking no for an answer, so he decided to go ahead and have his triumph anyway. On the day of the triumph, he rode in a chariot alongside his sister, Claudia, who is a Vestal Virgin. So what does her presence do for him in this moment? Well, number one, again, you have the Vestals kind of representing the will of Vesta, who is a very patriotic Roman goddess. It's almost like saying that Vesta, our goddess Vesta, said it was okay. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is that the Vestals themselves were sacrosanct. So it was a crime to cause them bodily harm. So any attempt to stop this triumph from happening, any attempt to force the triumph to stop, would have endangered anyone trying to stop it. There would have been a danger that they accidentally caused bodily harm to this Vestal, and then that would have incurred divine wrath and ritual impurity on themselves. Not to mention probably also secular punishment as well, because messing with the Vestals means you're messing with Vesta, who has this prominence, this significance for the safety of the state. So it's a big no-no, you can't do it. So her presence allowed this triumph to go on and actually, it allowed her brother to have the triumph without interference. So these are just some examples that stick out to me of how embedded in the political system, in the administration, the Vestals actually were. It's tempting to think of these Vestals as cloistered away for 30 years doing nothing but tending this fire. But in fact, they were out and about, they were present, and they were able to make things happen or not happen depending on their own will and also their relationship with other prominent people, especially Augustus. Always comes back to him, doesn't it? My last main takeaway from this fall is the notion of the Vestals as purificatory priestesses. One of the guiding texts for me as I was putting the course together was the study of the Vestals done by Robin Lorsch Wildfang. And Wildfang takes the position that the Vestals were purely purification priestesses. That the Vestals' only function was purification. I think that may be going a little too far. I'm not ready to say that that was their sole or even their primary function. But Wildfang brings up some really good examples to show that this was at least one of the things that the Vestals were concerned with. The Vestals participated in a bunch of different rites throughout the Roman calendar. A lot of them show up in Ovid's Fasti from the first half of the year. In a few cases, you can see specifically how their presence at these festivals was to carry out some kind of purification act. For example, there's a festival called the Festival of the Argae. It's an obscure rite. We know about it from Ovid's Fasti, and we know about it from Dionysius of Halicarnassus. Essentially, during the festival, effigies were made out of plant matter and stuff to resemble men that were bound at their hands and feet. And these effigies would be thrown into the Tiber River, and the Vestals either did this themselves or participated in some way in this throwing of the effigies into the Tiber River. Now, Ovid makes a big fuss and says that this is not a holdover from when the Romans used to do human sacrifice. How dare you? It probably is. But anyway, most people think that this is a purification ceremony because of its placement in the calendar right after the Lemuria festival. And the Lemuria festival was when you clear all the unfriendly ghosts out of your house, and then this would be sort of a secondary step to say, okay, they've been cleared out of the house, and then we take them and we send them away for good. And I see no reason to disagree with this. That makes sense to me. So the Vestals' presence and their participation in this rite, whatever their participation was, would put them in a purification context. But there's a much more explicit example, and apologies because we're going to get a little gruesome here. The Romans celebrated a rite called the Forticidia in April, where a pregnant cow was sacrificed. One or many, perhaps, were sacrificed. Now, the Vestals did not do the sacrifice themselves. There were special people that were designated to do sacrifices. The Vestals were not killing anyone or anything, but once the pregnant cow was sacrificed, then the chief Vestal, and this is coming directly from Ovid, the chief Vestal would take the unborn calf, the unborn fetus, and burn it on their altar fire, presumably the fire of Vesta, I'm not entirely sure, and then they would take the ashes and keep them as part of their purification toolkit, and then a few days later at the Perilia, they would take these ashes and some other items out and do a purification ritual for the entire population. So Ovid says this very explicitly. You can see here the Forticidia entry and the Perilia entry and how the ashes were used to purify the people. And then lastly, the Vestals carried out purifications in their own home, the Vestal Temple complex. This should be the least surprising, I think, of anything, because they were responsible for tending the temple in every way, including in keeping it clean and in purifying it. So every year at the traditional New Year, which in the old Roman calendar was March 1st, the Vestals would clear out the temple, they would sweep away all the ashes, they would revive the fire, sort of reset the fire, and sweep all of the ashes and everything else that had been temporarily ritually discarded in the complex would then be taken out. Again, that's not very surprising that the Vestals would be purifying their own space. If you have any sort of spiritual or religious practice of your own, you know that that's one of the most basic things. But again, it's worth noting because Wildfang's main argument is that these priestesses were purification priestesses, and this is some of the evidence for that. So again, I don't think this is their only function, but it is a function of theirs that I had not considered until I read this book, so I wanted to bring it to your attention here. And that's it. Those are the 3 takeaways that I wanted to talk about today. Of course, there's so much about Vesta and the Vestals and Hestia that we talked about, so much that we learned, so much that I learned. This is an ongoing process. You'll hear more from me about Vesta in the future, but for now I'm going to put her away and return to Apollonius of Tyana, which I've been working on for the past several months. So that'll be the next video that comes out, is the 2nd installment in Apollonius of Tyana. I'm trying to find a way to make it not over 2 hours, but I suspect it will be over 2 hours. So yeah, thank you again, truly, sincerely, from the bottom of my heart, to everyone who participated in this course of discovery for Vesta and the Vestals. I really had a great time. I enjoyed putting it together. I do want to do more of these in the future, although I don't have any plans right now. So if this is something you're interested in, if you either participated in the first course or if you were thinking about it and maybe would be interested in doing a deep dive with me, stay tuned here. YouTube will be the first place that I announce anything if anything comes up. So in the meantime, off to Apollonius. Thank you all for watching. I hope you found this video useful. I hope you learned something. Oh, if you did participate in the course, let me know in the comments what your main takeaway was or what some of your takeaways were. I'm wondering where we overlap and what other insights you've had since we wrapped up in the fall. And yeah, that's it. Thank you all for watching. I truly appreciate it. If you like this kind of thing and you want to see more, go ahead and subscribe. If you like this video, you can let me know by leaving a thumbs up. So I'll see you in the comments, and that's all I have for you today. So thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next one.